Do you believe that animals can feel gratitude? What if I told you that a bear cub, rescued from the brink of death, returned years later to do something completely unexpected? Amid the darkness of a freezing night, where the piercing wind blew mercilessly and the silence of the forest was interrupted only by the rustling of the ice-covered trees, a small bear struggled to survive. Lost, weak, and powerless, he could barely move. His paws sank into the deep snow, his fur soaked from the extreme cold. Alone and vulnerable, this cub's fate seemed sealed. But what happened next challenges everything we know about the connection between humans and animals. This story took place in one of the most hostile regions on the planet, the icy and unforgiving Siberia, a place where temperatures can drop below 50 degrees Celsius, where nature does not forgive the weak, and where each night can be the last for those who cannot find shelter. It was there that a lonely man, unknowingly, was about to make a decision that would change two lives forever. Mikhail Volkov, a retired hunter, had chosen the solitude of the forest as his refuge. He knew every inch of that frozen land, every sound of the wild. But that night something made him stop. An almost imperceptible sound in the middle of the storm, a faint wail, a cry for help from somewhere in the darkness. His instincts were screaming at him to ignore it. After all, interfering with wildlife could be dangerous, but something inside him made him follow that calling. He walked slowly, his feet sinking into the soft snow, until he spotted a small shadow huddled next to a fallen tree. A bear cub, exhausted and almost frozen, was barely breathing. Mikhail knew what that meant. Such a young cub alone in the forest could only mean one thing. His mother was no longer there to protect him. Perhaps she had been hunted. Perhaps she had fallen victim to cruel nature itself. The truth is that that little bear was doomed to a cruel fate, until Mikhail made a decision. He hesitated for a moment. Bonding with a wild animal is never a good idea. But then the cub lifted its head, its eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. A look that didn't ask for pity, but rather a last hope. And now, what would you do in this situation? Would you risk your safety to save a life, or would you move forward, accepting the relentless laws of nature? Comment below. Mikhail took a deep breath. He knew he was about to break a cardinal rule of the jungle, but at that moment his decision had already been made. He bent down, stretched out his hands, and without thinking twice, picked up the puppy in his arms. The warmth of the fragile little body contrasted with the biting cold of the night. What he didn't know was that this simple gesture, this moment of compassion, would not only save that little creature, but would come back to haunt him in ways no one could have ever imagined. With the puppy in his arms, Mikhail felt his heart racing. That small body was shaking, and its breathing was shallow. He didn't have much time. Walking quickly to his cabin, each step felt like a race against the inevitable. The wind howled around him, as if nature itself was testing his resolve. Was he doing the right thing? Once inside, Mikhail lit the wood stove, warmed a blanket, and prepared some warm milk. The puppy, still without strength, could barely open its eyes. He placed it near the fireplace, trying to bring some warmth to this fragile life. Time seemed to freeze along with the storm outside. Every second was an uncertainty, an agonizing wait for the moment when that little bear would react. And then, a small sigh, a slight movement. The puppy opened its eyes for a moment and, with effort, placed its head in Mikhail's hands. At that moment, something changed. It wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger, a bond that time could never erase. But before continuing this incredible story, I want to know your opinion. Do you believe that animals are capable of remembering those who helped them? That they can feel gratitude even after years? Comment below. Your participation makes all the difference. And if this story has already touched your heart, leave a like. This helps the channel grow and allows more people to discover exciting stories like this. And of course, if you love incredible rescue stories, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you don't miss any exciting videos we have here. Now hold on tight, because what happens next will surprise you even more. Siberia does not forgive. The white expanse stretched for miles, a desolate and unforgiving landscape where few dared to live. In the midst of that biting cold, where the ice crunched underfoot and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, a lonely man called that land home. Mikhail Volkov had spent years in that wild territory, a retired hunter, a man who knew every detail of the frozen forest, every sign of nature. He knew where the snow was treacherous, where the rivers froze solid, where wolves hunted at night. But no matter how experienced he was, he would never have imagined that on that specific night, his life would change forever. Mikhail's hut stood on the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by snow-heavy pines and absolute silence. The winter of 2013 was especially cruel. The thermometer already read 48 degrees C, and any prolonged exposure to the open air meant freezing within minutes. That night, as he stoked the fire and prepared hot soup, a faint sound came from outside. At first he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again. A groan. Low, distant, weak. He frowned and approached the door, pulling on his wolf fur coat before leaving. The icy wind hit his face like sharp blades. The forest seemed dead, as if everything was hibernating, waiting for spring. But that sound was coming from somewhere nearby. A cry for help lost in the immensity of nothingness. Mikhail walked, his feet sinking into the thick snow, his eyes alert to the darkness. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but his instinct told him to keep going. And then, just a few meters away, he saw it. A small shadow huddled next to a fallen tree. At first it looked like just a pile of accumulated snow, but as he got closer he realized what it was. A bear cub, too small to be left alone, trembling, hair covered in ice. His eyes were half open, his breathing was shallow. Mikhail froze. He knew what that meant. Bear cubs are never alone. If his mother wasn't around, that could only indicate one thing. She wasn't coming back. Maybe she had been killed by poachers, maybe she had fallen into some frozen river. But regardless of the reason, that cub had no chance of surviving alone. For a moment, Mikhail hesitated. He knew that interfering with wildlife could have consequences. He knew that bonding with a wild animal could be a mistake. But then the little cub lifted his head with an almost painful effort, and his eyes met Mikhail's. And in that look, there was no aggression, there was no fear, just a silent request. One last ray of hope. What would you do in this situation? Would you ignore the instinct of compassion or risk everything to save that little life? Comment below and tell me your opinion. Your participation is essential so that more stories like this reach more people. Time was running out. Mikhail felt a wave of adrenaline course through his body. There was no way I could leave him there. He bent down, extended his arms, and carefully picked up the cub. His body was cold, almost rigid. He barely had the strength to move. If he stayed there for a few more minutes, he wouldn't survive. With quick steps, Mikhail returned to his hut. The wind now seemed even stronger, as if trying to prevent this unlikely rescue. When he finally entered, he closed the door tightly and ran to the fireplace. He placed the cub on a blanket near the fire and began rubbing his little paws, trying to bring back the heat. Time passed slowly. The silence was tense. Mikhail took some warm milk and tried to bring it to his mouth. At first, the puppy didn't react. His body was stiff, weak. But then, after a few seconds of agony, he moved his head. Slowly, his tongue touched the warm liquid. It was a small move, but for Mikhail, it was a sign that there was still hope. If you believe that every act of compassion generates consequences, leave your like. This helps this video reach more people who are moved by real stories of incredible rescues like this. The next few hours were a battle. Mikhail kept the cub warm, feeding it little by little. His breathing, previously weak and unstable, began to regulate. The tremors subsided. The warmth of the cabin and the meticulous care were, little by little, bringing that little bear back to life. When the morning sun finally began to rise over the horizon, turning the snow a pale gold, Mikhail noticed something extraordinary. The cub opened its eyes completely, and this time they were full of life, filled with something that felt like gratitude. He wasn't sure if animals were capable of sensing recognition, but at that moment, looking into that little bear's eyes, Mikhail was sure that a bond had been created, something that time could not erase. But this story is far from over. What happened in the following days was even more surprising. And if you want to continue following this exciting rescue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you don't miss the next chapter of this unbelievable story. Because what happened next, no one could have ever predicted. Mikhail watched the little being huddled in the snow hole. Its once dense and protective fur now seemed too thin to withstand the cold. The cub breathed raggedly, each exhalation releasing small white clouds into the frigid air. Its paws were weak, its eyes half closed as if it was already accepting its fate. The silence of the forest seemed to weigh even more heavily on that moment. There were no signs of her mother, no recent traces. Mikhail's mind tried to fight his own urge to help. He knew that interfering with the natural course of things could have consequences. Bears were not domesticable animals. They were not dogs or cats that could simply be taken to a shelter. If you helped this puppy now, what would happen next? Could he survive on his own? But then the cub made one last move. His head fell slightly to the side, and in that instant, his eyes met Mikhail's. Small, black, deep. There was no aggression, no resistance, just an expression that could very well be interpreted as a request. As if, even without words, that bear was begging for one last chance. The biting wind whipped Mikhail's face, but he had already made his decision. He slowly bent down, stretched out his gloved hands and touched the cold little body. The cub was as cold as the ice itself around him. If he stayed there for a few more minutes, his breathing would stop. With a firm movement, Mikhail lifted the cub into his arms. The weight was insignificant for an animal that one day was expected to become one of the forest's biggest predators. But now he was just a baby fighting for his life. Mikhail pulled his coat up to partially cover him and quickened his pace back to his hut. The walk was difficult. The thick snow slowed his movements, and the wind seemed to push him back. The weight in his arms increased with each meter, not because of the size of the puppy, but because of the weight of the decision he had just made. He knew he was breaking an essential rule of nature. Bears belong in the forest, and humans should keep their distance. But what happens when the forest fails? When does the mother not return? When the only option is certain death? Mikhail's hut appeared in front of him like a refuge in the middle of the white expanse. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and entered quickly, closing it behind him. The heat from the fire hit his face immediately, a brutal contrast to the cold outside. Wasting no time, he placed the puppy on a pile of blankets near the fireplace. The small body was still shaking. The eyes were blinking slowly. Mikhail knew he needed to act quickly. He took a clean cloth and began to dry it, removing the ice accumulated between the hairs. Then he heated some milk and poured it into a small bowl. He took a clean cloth, dipped it in the warm liquid, and brought it to the puppy's mouth. For long minutes, nothing happened. Mikhail's heart quickened. Was he too late? So, a little movement. The puppy's tongue touched the milk almost by reflex. Another second, and he licked again. Mikhail held his breath. Little by little, the little bear began to drink, weak, hesitant, but alive. Time seemed to drag by. For hours, Mikhail remained there, watching every breath, every small movement. At some point, without realizing it, he dozed off in the chair next to the fireplace. It was a soft sound that woke him up, a low growl, almost a groan. He opened his eyes and saw the cub moving for the first time. He was no longer lying inert as before. Now he raised his head and looked around, analyzing his new surroundings. Mikhail smiled for the first time that night. He had made the right decision. But what to do now? Keeping a bear indoors was not sustainable. He needed a plan. I couldn't just leave it in the woods and expect it to survive on its own. Over the next few days, he improvised. He fed the little one with milk mixed with honey and fish. She kept him warm, and little by little watched his strength return. On the third day, the cub tried to get up, staggering, clumsy, but determined. On the 5th day, he was already exploring small corners of the cabin. And on the 10th day, Mikhail knew that that bear had already taken a place in his life that he hadn't expected. He needed a name. Without knowing why, Mikhail looked at the little one and said, Misha. It was a common name in Russia, but also a diminutive for bear in some regions. Simple, strong. And so Misha began to become more than just a rescued bear. He started to be part of that house. However, Mikhail knew that this could not last forever. Bears grow up. Bears get strong. Bears don't belong in human cabins. But every time he thought about it, he looked at Misha, now sleeping curled up by the fireplace, and he felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but something inside him already knew. Separation would be inevitable. If you've made it this far, I want to know your opinion. Do you believe that animals can create real bonds with humans? That even wild people can feel connection and trust? Comment try or no below and tell me what you think. Your comment makes all the difference so that this story reaches more people. And of course, if you are involved in this journey as much as I am, leave a like. This helps bring more incredible stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story, because what comes next is even more surprising. The heat of the cabin contrasted violently with the relentless cold outside, but even inside, Mikhail knew the weather was against him. Misha's small body was still shaking, even under layers of blankets. His hair was damp, cold, and his breathing, still irregular, was almost imperceptible. The old hunter knelt by the fireplace, rubbing the cub's small paws with his gloved hands, trying to get the circulation back. He didn't know much about bears other than what his experience as a hunter had taught him, that they were strong, dangerous, and merciless when threatened. But this puppy was nothing like that. This was just a helpless creature, struggling to survive, clinging to whatever spark of life was still left inside him. Mikhail took a clean cloth, dipped it in warm milk, and gently placed it on the puppy's lips. At first, there was no response. He repeated the gesture, lightly pressing the side of the little bear's mouth. A small reaction, an almost involuntary movement of the tongue, a sign that he was still there, still holding on to a thread of hope. Little by little, drop by drop, Misha began to swallow the liquid. For hours, Mikhail repeated this process, feeding him little by little, watching his breathing, feeling his body gain a little more heat. Time seemed to drag by. The wind outside roared as if the forest was claiming that cub for its own. But Mikhail did not relent. He spent the entire night by the fire, watching every little movement. At times he feared that Misha wouldn't resist, that she would simply close her eyes and never wake up. But then at dawn, something changed. Misha moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a little stretching of the paws, a deeper sigh. But for Mikhail, it was a miracle. He smiled, a tired smile but full of relief. I still didn't know what I would do with that puppy, how I would guarantee its survival in the following days. But at that moment, none of that mattered. The important thing was that he was still there. Over the next few days, Misha began to regain strength. His appetite increased every day, and he began to get up, still clumsy, tripping over his own paws, but determined. His gaze, once weak and opaque, now shone with curiosity. He followed Mikhail with his eyes, watching the man's every move, as if trying to understand who that figure was that had given him a second chance. It was in the first week that the bond between the two truly began to form. Misha, once fragile and hesitant, now began to behave like a healthy puppy. He tried to stand on his hind legs, explored every corner of the hut, sniffed the objects scattered on the floor, nibbled on Mikhail's boots whenever he got the chance. He was still small, but he was already showing signs of a strength that would one day transform him into an imposing beast. Mikhail found himself laughing to himself at his antics. On a particularly cold day, he woke up to find the cub curled up in his own clothes, tangled up in fabrics as if trying to create his own den. In another, Misha managed to push one of the food containers and spill it all over the floor, spreading the smell of dried fish throughout the cabin. Every day was a new discovery, new proof that this little being would not only survive, but fight to live. But with this new energy also came challenges. He began to test his limits, to bite the wooden furniture, to climb the barrels in the corner of the cabin. Mikhail knew this was natural. Misha was growing, and bears need to move, need to explore. But there, in that closed space, there wasn't much to do. And that was when the inevitable question came. What would happen when Misha grew up? He still fit in Mikhail's arms now, but that wouldn't last long. What would you do when he was too big to stay inside the cabin? What would happen when his wild instincts truly awakened? Mikhail didn't want to admit it, but every time he looked at the cub, he felt a tightness in his chest. He knew this bond couldn't last forever. However, until that day arrived, he decided that he would do everything in his power to ensure that Misha stayed strong. He started taking him outside, first for a few minutes, just so he could feel the snow under his paws, so he could reconnect with nature. At first, Misha hesitated. He looked at the white expanse around the cabin cautiously, as if that world was unknown to him now. But little by little, he began to loosen up. He dug into the snow with his little claws, sniffed the freezing air, chased small sticks that Mikhail threw. He was still a puppy, but here, in that environment, he seemed to belong. One night, as they sat side by the fire outside, Mikhail looked up at the sky and let out a long sigh. He couldn't say what he felt, a mixture of pride at seeing Misha recovering, but also a silent fear of what was to come. Because deep down, he already knew that bear didn't belong to him. What do you think Mikhail should do? Continue caring for little Misha, or find a way to return him to the forest? Comment Misha below to show me that you are following this story to the end. Your comment is very important for the channel and helps me bring more exciting stories like this. And if this connection between man and animal has already touched your heart, leave a like. This really helps the channel to continue bringing these incredible stories. If you're not already subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe and activate the bell, because what comes next in this story, you won't believe it. The days passed slowly in that white immensity of Siberia, and each dawn brought with it a little progress for Misha. The cub who could barely hold his head up now explored the surroundings of the hut with an almost naive curiosity. At first his steps were shaky, hesitant, but with each new foray into the snow, he seemed to gain more confidence. His body, once thin and fragile, was now beginning to show signs of the natural strength a bear should have. Mikhail watched the cub's every move with a mix of fascination and concern. He knew he was creating a bond that should never have existed. Bears are wild animals, made to live in the forest, hunt, fight for survival. But somehow, Misha seemed to have grown attached to him in a way Mikhail hadn't expected. And the most surprising thing? He himself felt the same. Every morning, as soon as Mikhail woke up and got out of bed, Misha was already there, lurking by the fireplace, waiting for him. The instant the man moved, the cub stood up, shook its fur, and followed him like a shadow. At first, this was funny. He tripped over his own paws, sank into the soft snow when trying to walk on Mikhail's tracks, grumbled softly whenever he found himself stuck in a pile of ice. But over time, his movements became firmer, more agile, and he began to follow Mikhail without difficulty. It was during this period that Mikhail began to notice small details that made Misha different from any other animal he had ever encountered in the forest. Whenever he offered food, the puppy made a low sound, a deep purr that resembled the satisfaction of a cat. He had never heard a bear do this before. It was a sound of confidence, of contentment. It was as if Misha was showing gratitude, as if he was saying in his own way that he knew what Mikhail had done for him. This behavior was repeated at other times. When Mikhail returned from collecting firewood, Misha approached and rubbed against his leg, something unthinkable for an animal of its species. And every night, when the fire in the fireplace dwindled and the cold took over the cabin, he huddled in a corner next to the bed, never trying to invade the man's space, but always maintaining a constant presence. The relationship between them evolved in an unexpected way. Mikhail knew that at some point, he would need to prepare Misha to return to the forest. He began teaching him how to find food on his own, hiding small pieces of frozen fish and meat in the snow, so the cub would use his sense of smell and claws to dig them up. At first, Misha seemed confused. He looked at Mikhail as if asking for an explanation, expecting the food to be delivered directly to him, as it always did. But, after a few tries, instinct began to emerge. He sniffed, dug, and when he finally found food, he let out that satisfied purr. One of the most striking scenes took place on a particularly cold morning. Mikhail decided to take him a little further away from the cabin so he could get used to being in the forest again. But as soon as he took a few steps into the woods, he noticed that Misha was hesitating. The cub looked around, sniffed the air, and instead of going forward, he turned around and ran towards Mikhail, placing his front paws on his leg, as if he wanted to be carried. It was a request for security, a demonstration that, despite growing and becoming stronger, he still saw Mikhail as his only reference, his only protection. The man's heart sank. He knew that if he continued to prolong this bond, he would be interfering with the cub's nature in a way that might be irreversible. But how to keep him away, when all he knew from the moment he was saved was the company of a human? The first attempt to let him sleep outside the cabin was a failure. Mikhail set up a small fur-covered structure outside near the woodpile, so he could begin to get used to being alone at night. But it didn't take long to hear Misha grumbling. He growled softly, walked in circles, and at one point began digging at the cabin door, desperate to get inside. When Mikhail opened the door, he saw the puppy shivering, not from the cold but from anxiety. He had never slept alone before. His instinct told him he needed a mother, a guide, someone to protect him. And at that moment, Mikhail realized that he was not just a man who had saved a bear. He was, for Misha, her only family. But time was running against both of them. Misha was growing up fast. His paws were already wider, his bite stronger. He was still playful and docile, but Mikhail knew that wouldn't last forever. Wild instinct sooner or later would speak louder. One night as they sat by the fire, Misha looked at Mikhail differently. It wasn't a look of fear or need, like before. It was a firmer, more confident look, as if he knew something was changing. Mikhail ran his hand through the cub's thick fur and sighed. He had never allowed himself to bond with an animal before. But there he was, feeling a tightness in his chest as he thought about what he would have to do soon. He needed to make a decision. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Mikhail should continue protecting Misha, or should he start preparing him to return to the forest? Comment Urso here below, so I know that you are following this incredible story until the end. Your comment makes all the difference to the channel and helps me bring more exciting stories like this. And if this connection between man and animal has already touched your heart, leave a like. This really helps the channel to continue bringing these unforgettable stories. If you're not already subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe and activate the bell, because what comes next in this story, you won't believe it. Spring arrived silently, slowly dissolving the white blanket that covered the forest. The ice melted, forming small streams that snaked across the previously frozen landscape, and the first signs of life began to emerge. Birdsong echoed through the branches, the rivers began to flow again, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. It was nature's awakening after months of brutal winter. But for Mikhail, this wasn't just a change of season. It was a cruel reminder that his time with Misha was running out. The cub was no longer a small, defenseless being fighting to survive. His once clumsy steps were now firm and precise. Its claws, which could barely tear the surface of the snow, were now sharp enough to tear chunks out of fallen logs. He was stronger, bigger, and with that, his wild instincts began to awaken. Mikhail noticed small changes. Misha sniffed the air more closely, paid more attention to the sounds of the forest, and on a few occasions growled softly when she heard something in the distance. Small signs that, despite the connection they had created, nature was calling for him. Mikhail knew he needed to act before it was too late. Each day that passed made the separation more difficult. He needed to be rational. I needed to do what was right. But how can you abandon someone who, for so long, was your only companion? Someone he cared for, protected, and watched grow? He postponed the decision for days. I found excuses to wait a little longer. Maybe Misha wasn't ready yet. Maybe he needed to learn more about how to feed himself. Maybe it was too soon. But deep down, he knew it wasn't Misha who wasn't ready. It was himself. So, one cold morning, he forced himself to make the decision. He left early, prepared his backpack, and took a large piece of dried fish, one of Misha's favorite foods. He whistled at the bear, who immediately ran up to him, shaking his head from side to side, as he always did when he knew he was going to get something special. "Come on, kid," Mikhail murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. They walked for hours, following a trail Mikhail knew well. It was a valley where vegetation had already started to grow again, a safe place, far from hunters, and with an abundance of streams and fish. The perfect place for a young bear to start his life in the wild. Misha followed beside him, suspecting nothing. The sun broke through the treetops, illuminating the bear's thick fur, which now had a healthy shine. He was at the peak of his vitality, ready for the wild. When they reached their destination, Mikhail stopped. He took a deep breath. His eyes analyzed every detail of that place, memorizing everything. Misha sniffed the air curiously, but soon turned his attention to Mikhail. He knew the man always had something planned, something to teach, and he waited patiently for the next command. Mikhail opened his backpack, took the dried fish, and placed it on the ground, just in front of the bear. "It's time, boy." The voice was lower than he intended. Misha looked at him, then at the fish. He took a hesitant step, lowered his snout and smelled the food, but didn't eat it. Instead, he raised his head and looked back at Mikhail, as if waiting for him to tell him what to do next. That look hit him like a punch in the chest. For so long, Misha had waited for Mikhail to guide her steps, to teach, to protect. Now there before him, the young bear, waited once again for his guidance. But for the first time, Mikhail had nothing left to teach. "You need to go," he murmured. But Misha didn't move. The silence between the two was almost unbearable. Mikhail looked at him, trying to hold back his emotion. He knew that if he showed any weakness now, everything could fall apart. Then he forced a step back, then another. Misha frowned, confused. Mikhail took another step back, and then he turned around. He waited to hear the bear's heavy footsteps moving away. He waited for Misha to accept and simply disappear into the forest. But that's not what happened. Instead, he heard something he never expected. A groan. Low. Soft. Mikhail Perot. His heart raced. He clenched his fists, eyes closed, trying to find the strength to keep walking. But when he heard another sound, this time a longer grumble, he turned around. Misha was still there. He hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed on him, her head tilted to the side, as if she didn't understand what was happening. As if he was waiting for Mikhail to come back and say this was all just another training session, another lesson. The bear took a small step forward. Mikhail felt a knot in his throat. He needed to go. He closed his eyes one last time and turned around again. He started walking. This time he wouldn't stop. 10 steps, 20, 30. The silence behind him was suffocating. He wanted to look back, but he couldn't. And then, when he was at a safe distance, he heard the sound that sealed his decision. Branches breaking, leaves being crushed. And then, silence. When he finally gave in to temptation and looked back, Misha was no longer there. He's gone. The young bear had disappeared into the forest, just as he should have. Mikhail stood there, still, feeling the wind touch his face, listening to the subtle sounds of nature around him. Relief should come. He should be satisfied knowing he did the right thing. But all I felt was a deep emptiness, because in that moment he realized that he hadn't just saved Misha months ago. Misha had also saved him. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to say goodbye to someone you loved, even though you knew it was the right thing to do? Comment "longing" below and share your story. Your comment is very important for the channel. and helps me bring more exciting stories like this. And if this farewell moved you, leave a like. This makes all the difference so that more people know this story. If you are not yet registered, take the opportunity to sign up and activate the bell, because what comes next is even more unbelievable. Time passed. The seasons came and went, bringing with them the relentless cycle of nature. The winters were as harsh as they had ever been, and the springs, although short, brought life back to the forest. Mikhail continued to live the same way, hunting, fishing, surviving in his isolated cabin in the icy vastness of Siberia. He had chosen that solitary life and never regretted it, or at least, that's what he told himself. But the truth was that something inside him had changed since the day he said goodbye to Misha. At first, the absolute silence of the cabin felt heavier. For weeks, he would find himself looking at the corner where the young bear used to sleep, hoping to hear the familiar sound of his low purr or the impatient growl when he wanted attention. But the silence continued. The wild world had resumed its course, and Misha was now part of it, or at least that's what Mikhail believed. The first signs that something strange was happening came in subtle ways. Footprints, gigantic. He found them one morning, scattered around the cabin, deep marks in the snow, larger than any wolf or common animal in that region. Bear footprints, but not just any bear. They were huge, much bigger than any he had ever seen before. He bent down to examine them, ran his fingers along the outline in the snow, and felt a shiver run up his spine. Could it be Misha? The idea seemed absurd. Years had passed. He should be far away, living like any other wild bear, hunting, hibernating, avoiding humans. But then something even stranger started to happen. The animals that used to roam the cabin have disappeared. The wolves, which were often seen in the distance, hunting in packs, disappeared. Foxes, which always appeared in search of food scraps, stopped approaching. Even the crows, always on the lookout for any sign of easy meat, were more cautious. It was as if something bigger was imposing a new order around there, as if a powerful predator had marked that territory. Mikhail didn't know what to think. He spent nights watching out the window, trying to catch any movement in the darkness. Sometimes I swore I saw a shadow moving through the trees, something big. But whenever he went out to check, he found nothing but the oppressive silence of the forest. Then came the night that changed everything. The storm was strong. The wind was roaring outside as if it wanted to rip the cabin off the ground. The fire in the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls, and Mikhail, sitting in his chair, absently stroked the blade of his knife, lost in thought. It was then that he heard it. A deep, guttural sound. A roar. But it was no ordinary roar. It wasn't a warning call, nor the sound of a bear searching for food. It was something different. It was a warning. Mikhail jumped to his feet, picked up his rifle, and went to the door. He opened it slowly, feeling the cold wind whip his face. The darkness of the forest was almost total, but his experienced eyes knew where to look. Then he saw it. Two silhouettes in the middle of the snow. One of them, smaller but agile, moved cautiously among the trees. Mikhail immediately recognized her slender form and the way she moved. It was a wolf. He was close, very close to the cabin, but his behavior was not normal. He didn't appear to be hunting, nor did he show confidence. In fact, he seemed hesitant, scared. The second silhouette. Mikhail felt his heart stop for a moment. It was gigantic. The moon partially illuminated the scene, revealing a colossal bear standing just a few meters from the wolf. Its posture was imposing, its body covered in thick, dark fur. And even without seeing the creature's eyes, Mikhail knew. He knew. Misha. He was there. But he was no longer the little puppy who once slept by the fireplace. Now, he was a beast. Strong, imposing, a true king of the forest. And yet, he was there. The tension in the air was palpable. The wolf seemed to decide whether to run away or fight, but Misha didn't even need to move. With a single roar, deep and charged with authority, he sealed the smaller beast's fate. The wolf flinched, let out a small whimper, and without hesitation turned and disappeared into the trees. Mikhail felt his breathing hitch. Misha remained motionless for a few moments. Then slowly, he turned his head toward the cabin. He knew exactly where he was. Mikhail squeezed the door tightly, his heart beating out of control. He should be scared. After all, now, that bear was no longer a helpless cub. He was a predator at the height of his strength. But what he felt was not fear. It was something much deeper. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to have stopped. Then, as if he had made a silent decision, Misha turned and began walking slowly into the darkness of the forest. Mikhail stood still, unable to move, watching that being disappear into the shadows, exactly as he had done years ago. But this time, something was different. This time, Misha wasn't leaving. He was patrolling, protecting. Doubt grew inside Mikhail like an uncontrollable fire. Why was he still there? Why, after so long, did Misha remain near the cabin? Was this just a coincidence, or did he actually remember? The night passed without sleep. Mikhail sat at the table, rifle propped at his side, mind spinning with unanswered questions. When morning came, he went out to examine his surroundings. The giant footprints were still there, the smell of wolf, weaker. It was as if Misha had marked out that space as part of her territory. As if he was somehow telling Mikhail that this place was still his. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe that animals never forget those who help them? That a true bond can survive time, even between man and beast? Comment. I remember below to show me that you are following this incredible story until the end. Your comment makes all the difference to the channel and helps me bring more exciting stories like this. And if this moment moved you, leave a like. This helps the channel to continue bringing unforgettable stories. If you're not yet registered, take the opportunity to sign up and activate the bell, because what comes next? You won't believe it. The night was heavy. Darkness spread across the forest like an impenetrable veil. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak in protest against the biting cold. Mikhail sat by the fireplace, the heat from the fire casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Despite the apparent calm inside the cabin, he felt a strange restlessness. Ever since he found those giant footprints and saw Misha chasing away the wolf, he couldn't sleep soundly anymore. There was something different in the air, something he couldn't explain, but he felt it in every fiber of his body. Then, it happened. The silence was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. A roar. But it wasn't just any roar. It was powerful, throaty, full of strength and presence. A call coming from the depths of the forest. Mikhail stood up immediately, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his coat, his hunting knife, and without thinking twice, opened the cabin door. The cold hit his face like a sharp blade, but he ignored it. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement among the trees. Then he saw it. A few feet from the porch, standing in the snow, was a huge grizzly bear. His dark fur contrasted with the white of the ground, and his heavy breath came in clouds of hot vapor into the frigid air. He was gigantic, much larger than any bear Mikhail had ever seen in the region. But it wasn't just any bear. Era Misha. The world seemed to stop at that moment. Mikhail felt a mixture of emotions that he couldn't explain. Fear? No. Surprise? Perhaps. But most of all, he felt something he hadn't expected. Recognition. He looked into the eyes of that colossal bear, and despite the time that had passed, he knew exactly who was there. And strangest of all, Misha knew it too. The animal's eyes didn't carry aggression. There wasn't the predatory stance he knew so well in wild bears. On the contrary, there was something more there. Something deeper. Something that only anyone who has ever looked into the eyes of an animal with which they have created a bond could understand. But before Mikhail could fully process what was happening, Misha moved. He lowered his head and, with an almost ceremonial gesture, pushed something forward with his snout. Mikhail blinked, trying to understand. It was a deer, or rather, the body of a freshly hunted deer, still warm, lying on the snow. Mikhail couldn't believe his eyes. What did that mean? Why had Misha, a wild bear, brought a deer to his door? He knew bears hunted when necessary, but this was not normal behavior. He wasn't just feeding. He wasn't just killing to survive. He was leaving a gift. For a moment, Mikhail didn't know how to react. He stood still, looking at the bear, feeling a lump in his throat. Misha remained there for a few more seconds, watching him in silence. Then slowly, he lifted his head and let out one last low growl. Then, without rushing, he turned and walked back into the forest. Mikhail felt a shiver run down his spine. Misha remembered. He never forgot. The little cub he had saved, that helpless being who could barely walk through the snow, was now one of the biggest bears he had ever seen. And even after so much time, even after he had returned to nature, he didn't just remember. He came to thank you. Mikhail looked at the deer before him. It was still hot. It was a gift that could feed a man for weeks. He knelt down next to the animal and ran his hand through its thick fur, trying to understand what had just happened. Logic said that didn't make sense. Bears aren't like that. They don't show gratitude. They don't create bonds like that. They are born wild and live wild. But then why did Misha come back? Why did he leave that offering? Why was he still there, nearby, as if watching the cabin from a distance? Mikhail spent the rest of the night unable to sleep. He stood on the porch, observing the forest, trying to find some explanation for what he saw. But neither theory seemed plausible. Misha was no ordinary bear, and maybe, just maybe, there was something more between humans and animals than science could explain. Now tell me, do you believe that animals are capable of remembering those who helped them? That they can feel gratitude? If this story touched your heart, comment gratitude below and share this story with someone who loves animals. And if this moment moved you, leave a like. This really helps the channel to continue bringing incredible stories like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take the opportunity to activate the bell, because what comes next in this story, you won't believe it. Days passed, but Mikhail could not forget that night. The deer left on the porch, Misha's deep gaze before disappearing into the shadows of the forest. That haunted him, and at the same time filled him with an inexplicable feeling. All his life, he knew bears as predators, unpredictable, instinctive creatures, guided only by hunger and territory. But Misha was different. He had returned. The old hunter tried to convince himself that this was a coincidence. Maybe the bear was just wandering around the area. Maybe the game was left there for another reason. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to notice something strange. Misha was still around. He never got close enough to be seen clearly, but his presence was undeniable. Whenever Mikhail went out to collect firewood, he found huge footprints near the hut, as if he had patrolled the area. When he hunted and left the meat hanging outside to dry, nothing was touched. No other predators dared approach the property. Even the wolves, which occasionally tried to invade his pantry, seemed to have disappeared from the area. It was as if Misha had taken it upon himself to protect that territory, as if somehow he still recognized Mikhail as part of his story and was ensuring his safety. One morning, as Mikhail opened the door to breathe in the cold, early winter air, he noticed something new. On top of a hill not far away, standing among the bare trunks of snow-covered trees, was he, Misha. The colossal bear watched the cabin, motionless, as if it were assessing everything around it. Its thick fur gleamed in the morning light, and even from this distance Mikhail could feel the creature's grandeur. They stood there looking at each other, without any threat, without any words spoken, just a silent recognition. Then, as if knowing he had already been seen, Misha turned and disappeared into the trees again. This pattern repeated itself several times over the months, always at a distance, always in the shadows, but never too far away. He never crossed the line between wildlife and domestication. He never tried to approach the cabin like he did when he was a puppy, never ordered food, never tried to get in. It was as if he understood that his time there had passed. But still, it never went away completely. Mikhail felt a mix of emotions each time he encountered signs of her presence. He knew better than to get his hopes up that Misha was a wild animal, a predator at the top of the food chain. But deep down, Something inside him refused to believe that this was just instinct. One night, as he rested by the fire, he thought of his father's words many years ago, when he was still a young hunter. The rules of the jungle say that a bear never bows to a human. But maybe, just maybe, the hearts of animals have their own rules. He never fully understood the meaning of that sentence, until now. Misha wasn't there out of necessity. I wasn't there for food, for shelter, or for dependence. He didn't need Mikhail to survive. And yet, he was still around. It was a bond that went beyond logic, beyond nature, something that could not be explained, only felt. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe that animals can feel gratitude, even after years? That a true bond can last forever? Comment link below to show me that you followed this incredible story to the end. Your comment is essential for more people to learn about exciting stories like this. If this story made you rethink the connection between humans and animals, then you can't miss the next ones. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications to follow even more exciting and surprising stories. And tell me here in the comments, what did you feel when you saw Misha return? Write unbelievable to show that you followed this journey until the end. And now don't leave without watching the next video that is already appearing on the screen. Believe me, the story that comes next is even more impressive and will leave you speechless.